short time after I retired as a judge, I had a drainage problem in my home. So I duly rang the plumbing firm, and next morning when the crew arrived, I went out to greet them. As I approached to introduce myself, a young man said, "We've already met." I started to ask why, but he continued, "Yes, you gave me 9 months." So after that awkward moment, I then said, "Well, did you deserve it?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I was on drugs, my life was out of control, and this turned things around." So it's not often that a judge gets a testimonial face-to-face like that, and so I just couldn't resist sharing that with you. But that case was not typical. He was educated, he had a very supportive family, and obviously a good outcome. What is unfortunately more typical, perhaps occurring in more than 95% of the cases, is a story of the offender being disadvantaged. And so you have the sight of the offender's lawyer speaking to the judge. "Your Honour, my client had a troubled childhood. There's a lot of violence in the household. There's alcohol abuse and domestic violence, which led to a separation of the parents. And this resulted in frequent changes of home, changes of school." And I'm saying this is typical. That list goes on to, it's like a litany of emotional, sexual, physical abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, and violence in the home. And it was the constancy of this plea that really caused my interest. And I was fortunate at about that time to hear a lecture by an eminent paediatrician who introduced me to a large body of research dealing with the impact of disadvantage, particularly in the early years. What the experts tell us is that the development of a child's brain begins well before birth. And in the next 3 to 5 years, that development progresses. And you would always hope in an optimal way. That development is a complex interaction between genetics and the environment. Now, we can't do much about genetics, but we should attempt to provide an environment which will allow for the emotional and intellectual development of that child. The child's brain at this period is working very hard. It's where the neural connections are being made and the foundations for future development are being laid. Just look at those 5 images. I would take you quickly to the one for the 2-year-old. This wonders of brain scanning that we have now, you'll see that there's a very marked increase in that 2-year-old's brain. These are the neural connections that are being made. Trillions, 1,000 trillions new connections in 1 year for a 2-year-old. And you see the adult is probably less. So your brain probably has never worked as hard since you were a 3 or 4-year-old. The major threat to the development of those neural connections is chronic, prolonged, unbuffered stress. We call it toxic stress. And that occurs when a child experiences strong, frequent and/or prolonged adversity without adequate adult support, adequate adult buffering, a hug and a kiss and a reassurance. So it is that stress which interferes with the development of the neural pathways, which are the foundations of the future development of the brain. And the development of higher skills is very difficult if the lower circuits are not wired correctly. So without a strong foundation in these neural connections, the child is likely to suffer throughout life in the development of higher skills. The causes of toxic stress are probably known to many of you, particularly economic. Poverty is a very serious cause, physical, emotional abuse, chronic neglect, substance abuse, severe maternal depression, and exposure to violence, particularly family violence. You'll note that some of those can occur without fault, maternal depression. Some, like family violence, can occur in all stratas of society. Research also tells us that they've identified adult problems which have their causes in that early childhood. Now look at those. Crime, continuing violence, mental health problems, substance abuse, obesity, and even those health conditions of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. The sad thing is that you see in the adult problems a prediction of what might be for the future of the children of those adults. What happens to the child who suffers these adverse experiences is that that child is likely to go on life's trajectory as a high risk. And when compared, as you see, and that's with a normal or healthy trajectory, there is a gap. And you notice that gap is widening as the child gets older. That graph only goes up to 5 years, but that ability gap will continue and probably widen over life. That high-risk trajectory shows that a child will not be well prepared for school, will not prosper in the school setting, will have learning difficulties, probably behavioural problems. It's likely to be impulsive, lacking self-control. That's the child who'll be severely disciplined and indeed probably suspended. That's the child who'll be an early dropout from school without probably having learnt as much as others. That's the child that's likely to be involved in early teen pregnancy or coming to the notice of the police and the courts. The aim for all of us should be to avoid having children on that high-risk trajectory. A few months ago, my house was burgled. And so I can sympathise with other victims of crime. We had property was taken, particularly my son's car was stolen and abandoned in a creek bed and is written off. The immediate reaction to that event was, of course, anger. That your house had property been taken and your privacy so disrespected. There's that sense of violation. And there's probably a natural feeling that I'd like to mete out some immediate justice myself. And I'm sure I share those emotions with anyone who's been a victim of serious crime. not much sympathy for the perpetrator of crimes, regardless of the age of the offender. I mean, you only have to read the newspapers and the letter writers to hear the chants of, well, lock them up, throw away the key, send them off to boot camps. It's constant. And that's understandable in a sense. But there's always sympathy for the victim. And that's as it should be. People should stand up and support the victim and stand up against the crime itself. There's nothing that I would say that takes away that desire to support victims. But who was there for that 2- and 3-year-old child when he or she was suffering neglect or worse, abuse? Who was there? And who senses any injustice in the now teenager who was once abused being sent to long terms of imprisonment? There's no doubt there are some crimes where imprisonment is the obvious penalty and it must be done. But we know that oftentimes an offender like that will, after imprisonment, just be a more determined criminal. So the aim, of course, is to find a program which will try to help that person to be, as an adult, a better citizen and fit into the community. I'm not saying any of this is easy, and I'm not saying that nobody should go to jail. Obviously, people do have to go to jail to protect society. But we ought also to be aware, before we start the chant of lock them up, that there's often a longer history than is known to us. The real compelling question should be, how do we stop people going onto that high-risk trajectory of lost opportunity and continuing disadvantage? So, what can we do? Firstly, we should be informed about the unchallenged evidence of the experts that much of the crime and bad behaviour finds its origins in those early years of childhood when there's adversity and neglect. We should be active to support the parents and the children who are in disadvantaged circumstances, to try to give them an opportunity. And for the sake of our future prosperity, can we at least hope to have a society which is more equitable, where there is less poverty, less disadvantage, and where all children will have an opportunity for a life of fulfillment and prosperity? That, of course, would require a transformation of society, but let us all maintain the hope and be active in trying to achieve it. It's too late when the child's lawyer is before the judge pleading for sympathy for the offender. It's too late for the victim of crime who's suffered the financial and emotional burden of the crime committed against them. If you really want to reduce youth crime, if you really want to be tough on crime, then the answer is not in the words of the Lock 'em Up Brigade. It's in doing what we can to reduce early childhood disadvantage.